Castaway's Banner by Silas Jackson and Abigail Drake. Act 2. An Iron Knot. Weather turned bad now. Silence is the loudest sound. I have had my fill.
Chapter 7. The mountains hung halfway between heaven and earth, drear sides swathed in delicate mist, the jagged peaks snowy even in spring, colored by slant rays of afternoon sun falling through the breaks in the lofty clouds. The spine had been a blessing to the people of the Old World, albeit one fraught with peril. Steep ravines and sharp-edged cliffs seen from afar were tiny, barely visible cracks. Up close, they were yawning clefts through which the careless could fall to oblivion in an instant. Amidst those ageless scars in the rock, laced with greenery and knobby trees, Caven imagined he could see the apertures of tunnel mouths, ways into the labyrinthine bunkers which had preserved the elevated families and locked them away while the old world burned. He felt as if on this canvas of stone, things he had learned in history books had been drawn anew, or perhaps here, where time seemed not to touch, what he had learned was not history. Outside of a child's imagination, though, there was no trace of the bunkers to be seen through the sparkling city which had grown above them, tangling itself more and more thickly with every passing generation. Slowly, Caven trudged up the winding street. He stepped from underneath an overhanging bridge into better illumination. He paused, craning his neck to look at the final stretch of narrow street they needed to ascend to reach the entrance his father had been instructed to use. To an outsider, the double doors and triangular stone lintel did not look like anything special. The entrance was simple, unimpressive. A sideway for servants and messengers. The sculptures at two corners of the stairs beneath the door were far, far smaller and plainer than others Caven, his brother, and his father had passed since arriving at the capital city. But anyone who could recognize the symbols of the elevated would understand that what those statues represented far exceeded their size. The architects who placed those drakes of the king understood the spirit of them. Creatures perched high, far from the homes and dwellings below, fully aware of the horror and destruction which had descended on their land every moment since creation itself, but themselves unmoved by it. They were the lasting symbol of the elevated. They were a flag and a mascot, and more than both. The entrance led into the palace of the king, and however it looked, it could never be lowly. Caven hesitated in the cobbled street, turning to take in the entirety of Velvesone once more before the path brought them around a curve and the view was blocked by buildings. He stood in the street overlooking the nearby ridge, grinning his widest, with glass windows of buildings hugging stone seams aflame in reflected sun. How glorious it must be, Caven said, to live in a place so lofty, so beautiful, so hopeful. His father, Misha, smirked. After a few decades, it would become ordinary to you, like breathing. You would grow bored with these vistas, or simply inattentive. He stooped and elbowed Caven. Besides, don't you prefer our home and feeling solid ground under your feet? I do. Caven shrugged his small shoulders and lowered his gaze. The young man had not spoken so many consecutive words in some time, and the pushback would be enough to keep any impulse to speak from prevailing for some time more. Caven's brother cleared his throat. No one could honestly prefer the hinterlands to Valevisone. Why can't we live here? Misha shook his head. The ancestral seat of the Rutgers is in the hinterlands, he said. So what? Caven's brother asked. Some things are not meant to remain unchanged forever. True, Misha said, but a seat in the capital city is not given to our bloodline. Cloak Rutger did not earn it for his descendants. Was he worthy of praise? In many ways, yes. He could be called brave and virtuous, but he was not strong where war and politics were concerned. Bravado has always allowed the Richeza family, for one, to stick their necks out and gain concessions, amass access, and rule the mountains. For Rutgers, that bravado is not in our veins. But to quietly build your own house and take no interest in what others do is far from what the world considers commendable. It is certainly nowhere close to Markov's enduring example, which is what matters most. So the descendants of Cloak Rutger have less to bequeath and inherit than other families. Caven's brother frowned. You've always said that Cloak Rutger was admirable, and that it is shameful of the Richezas to choose luxury for themselves rather than support those who need it. Misha shrugged. Don't call the Richezas shameful while standing in the capital city. They believe in themselves more deeply than anyone, and they exact harsh punishments on whoever says they have flaws or limits. So yes, he dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, leaning towards his son with a sly smile. They are shameful. Their weakness is the opposite extreme of the Rutger weakness, which has forever been our failure to balance what we want with what we know is right, in a way that disadvantages ourselves. We leave the heights of this world to the Richezas of this world. I believe, young as you are, you're both being hit with a faint glimmer of that already. You might as well enjoy it, since it's never going to end. Misha grinned. Caven and his brother laughed nervously, merely at his expression and not because they understood much of what he had said. Indeed, their usually laconic father's apparent desire to prattle on about anything and everything was the strangest and most disturbing part so far of an already strange and disturbing trip to the capital. Tense, Caven silently followed, climbing the sloped street towards the humble side door of the palace. By the time the company approached the moonlit palisade surrounding Deepwater, Mimi's lead on the rest had diminished. Only a dozen feet ahead, like a drummer or color guard in the van of the tramping column, Mimi paused in the final stretch of road to the palisade and allowed her allies to catch up with her. Caven and Listara stepped forward, and the trio advanced to speak with the Night Watch alone, not wanting to sour their overture with the threat of violence which would be implicit if the entire mercenary unit marched directly to the gate. Mimi, Caven, and Listara did not fully reach the gate before a view slot in the heavy wood slid open, and a low, soft, slightly raspy voice called out to them. "Who goes there? And why have you come in the dark?" "We mean no harm to Deepwater," Listara called in return, holding her hands forward to show that they were empty. Mimi and Caven did the same. "We are soldiers who were cut off from our battalion and forced to make a desperate flight in another direction. We are exhausted and famished, and we request a chance to negotiate for food and lodgings." "Deepwater does not quarter or provision anyone's troops," the voice of the Night Watch said through the closed gate. "I am here too," Mimi said, stepping forward, "and I am no one's soldier. This unit hasn't come to Deepwater representing any particular leader or cause, so helping them cannot mar your neutrality. They've only come because they're tired, cold, and hungry." There was a pause before a dull, clunk suggested a lock being undone behind the gate. The wood slab moved on its groaning hinges, opening inward smoothly. Framed by an archway through the palisade, a tall, imposing woman stood swaddled in heavy furs, closed against the biting cold, covering the angles and bulk of armor underneath. She scratched a thin eyebrow with one gloved finger, adjusting the simple helm she wore over a thick, warm coif. "All right," the woman said, nodding curtly. "You may enter Deepwater and seek a place to eat and sleep, but you may not do so as an armed military unit. You must disarm in order to step through this gate." Mimi looked at Caven, sensing his instantaneous apprehension at the idea. "I think leaving the weapons outside would be best," she said. Caven frowned. "I agree with the show of good faith to these people. But if those creatures should reappear, or some other danger should befall us..." He didn't finish voicing the thought. Sure, Mimi and Lestara were already thinking the same thing. He glanced at Lestara. "Commander?" Lestara nodded. "We will disarm as a show of good faith, but not blind faith. We will leave 2 guards posted with the weapons, rotating them as needed so everyone has a chance to come inside the settlement for food and rest." Swords, axes, spears, daggers, and rifles were piled in the moonlit esplanade off the shoulder of the road, after cloaks and horse blankets were laid across the snow to provide the weapons with a clean, secure place to be set. 2 men were chosen from the column to take the first watch over the weapons stockpile, and the rest of the unit proceeded through the gate on foot, those who had horses leading them by the reins. Inside the walls of Deepwater, the road was clear of snow and ice, and the going was easier than the tired warfighters had enjoyed in many days. They proceeded quietly along the central thoroughfare of the settlement. Small windows, glowing with soft candlelight, floated to either side in the darkness around them. Buildings were crammed together, with low ceilings, low doorways, giving a general impression of competition with each other for the precious space within the settlement walls. The streets seemed deserted, with the locals already out of sight, taking shelter from the strangers. But in every alley opening off the main street, dark shapes flitted, keeping to the shadows of eaves and stoops. The watchers did not know about Caven's night vision. He saw them plainly, in crisp black and white, uniformed in drab armor and wolf pelts, leaning on walls or on the shafts of their poleaxes as they watched the procession in the street. The town guard was out in force, maintaining hushed, edgy vigilance as the disarmed soldiers wended their way along, led by the woman from the gate, who had since informed them her name was Leela. "Where are you bringing us?" Lestara asked. Leela glanced over her shoulder, not slowing her walk. "To the Thrave." Caven's mind flashed back on his first glimpse of Deepwater from afar, and the large, barn-like building he had taken to be the local Thrave. It was a reasonable place for the town guard to bring the strangers and hand them off, making them into someone else's problem to deal with. For all the anger, cruelty, vindictiveness, and hypocrisy underpinning the very existence of the Thrave, its clergymen were sometimes quite genuine in their efforts to help the wretched and downtrodden. In local Thraves, it was possible to find kind, sincere abbots who seemed to believe what they taught, in contrast to those who used the morals of the Thrave as a bludgeon and nothing else. Caven had met both kinds in his life, in separate people and occasionally coexisting in one individual. Apparently, the abbot of the local Thrave in Deepwater was the sort to feed and shelter the pitiful and wayward. Deepwater was large enough that the Thrave had not been visible from the gate, but was not large enough for the warfighters' moonlit promenade from the outer wall to the center of the settlement to be a long one. The cobbled thoroughfare branched onto a thin dirt walkway, and Leela took the new path without comment. Following behind her, Mimi, Caven, and Lestara maintained taciturn silence. No sound disturbed the night except for the shuffling of tired, aching feet. At the head of the walkway, Leela halted at the massive double doors of the Thrave. She raised her fist and knocked once, so quickly that it was obvious someone had been waiting inside the doors. They cracked open. A head peeked out and quietly conferred with Leela. Caven caught the words, "the strangers," and "need food and lodgings" amid the murmur. The speakers cast occasional glances in the direction of the haggard warfighters while they spoke, unaware that Caven could see clearly despite the darkness. The figures of other Thrave clergymen rounded the side of the building and approached the horses. They took the animals and led them away towards the stables. Caven and his brother swayed with the gait of the mule they shared. Following close to their father's horse, the boys watched the scenery change. Moving southwest from the spine, the character of the landscape transitioned with every day of travel. Outside of the capital itself, there were massive peaks shrouded in vaporous clouds, limpid snows, abandoned settlements, and stone cairns erected near precarious twists of the mountain path to mark that travelers had died there. Then the ground leveled. Huge, woolly animals grazed in alpine meadows, and there were stunted forests interspersed by high plateaus rising from tree cover like islands in a green sea. Wary nomads eyed the travelers as they passed encampments. Twice on the road, caravans of stranded passed, going in the direction of lofty Velvesone with lean oxen pulling wagons of ore. Gradually, the forest grew more dense and gnarled, huddling against rugged terrain, until it was so thick that the abundant sunshine of spring never pierced the primordial canopy, and whole days would pass with the travelers never glimpsing the sky. Mellifluous birdsong became ever-present, except in sudden, unnerving intervals of silence, and the occasional hunters' camps and remote settlements began to be recognizable by the children. They were in the hinterlands. After the first full day of travel through the hinterlands, before they made camp and built a roaring fire in anticipation of a rapid sunset and a spring night which had not quite relinquished the chill of winter, the trio saw a dark figure upon a horse waiting farther down the road. The man saw them and spurred his horse into a brisk trot. "You're here," the man called, relief evident in his voice. "Hayden," Caven's father responded. "Have you come to meet us?" Hayden nodded his shaggy head. "I will help you make camp tonight and accompany you from here." Hayden drew close enough to brush Caven's hood back with one broad hand and touzle the boy's hair. He smiled toothily. "Did you bring me anything from the capital, boy?" "No," Caven said sheepishly. "Then what use was the trip?" Hayden paused. His smile faltered, and he shot Misha an inquisitive look. Caven's father shrugged. "The trip was of very little use, as far as I can tell." Hayden frowned. "Then why did the king send for you? Why make you undertake such a journey if there was no good reason for it?" "The king reaffirmed to me that tradition will be upheld," Misha said, "and the next thresher of the Thrave will be from the Rutger family." Hayden nodded. It had become common knowledge that Thresher Balric was very ill and had little time left, and that each Thresher had Rutger blood in his or her veins was a tradition as old as the Thrave itself, beginning with Cloak Rutger and the inroads he made building peace between the elevated and the stranded, when others amongst the sainted Praetorians only perpetuated war. Why would he summon you to reaffirm that? Hayden asked, the skin near his eyes crinkling. The tradition is as lasting as the roots of the spine. What need is there to say it will continue to be observed? Misha shook his head doubtfully. I know it has long been deeply uncomfortable for the king to grant this special honor to an obscure family in a remote fiefdom, when there are other families who contribute much more to the wealth and prestige of the capital. Lately, the Richezas have been important allies to the king. When Thresher Balric dies, I'm sure nothing would please the king more than shoring up the support of the Richezas by honoring the family with the highest seat of the Thrave. Hayden groaned. That would trample on propriety. Caven's father nodded, which is why he can't do it. There are too many staunchly traditionalist powers in the capital, and though they might not actually care who has the title of Thresher, they would surely bristle at the principle of the thing, the blatant affront to established order. To the king, endearing himself to the Richezas might not be worth alienating other important families. Hayden blinked slowly, hence reassuring the patriarch of the Rutgers that tradition will be respected. And that was the only reason the king summoned you. Caven's father narrowed his eyes. His horse pawed at the road impatiently. No, he said after a hesitation. There was something else. The king is getting older. He is thinking about what legacy he will leave. He has been expanding elevated territory beyond the Basin of Storms to the east. Hayden's eyes widened. So his legacy will be more orphans across these lands? Yes, Caven's father said, voice flat. Why did he tell you this? Hayden asked. Because of the reputation of the Rutgers, creating peace and inroads between the elevated and the stranded. He wants me to go to the front lines, attached to the capital military, serving the dominators by placating the dominated. For that is what peace means to a man such as our king. Hayden frowned. Will you go? No, Caven's father said, and I don't know what my refusal will mean. The double doors opened wide, giving a view into the bright interior of the Thrave. Candles guttered on mounted holders, and a huge stone hearth radiated warmth and light. Leela and the robed clergyman she'd spoken with stepped aside, allowing the warfighters to begin filing into the large space of the building. When the doors closed behind them, a low susurrus had already broken out amongst the warfighters as they unburdened themselves of packs and kicked off snowy boots. Sighing, lowering their weary bodies to sit on creaking floorboards in corners or propped against walls, what had been an empty hall was now bustling with the slight movements and whispers of nearly 100 weary soldiers. On their feet in the center of the hall, Caven, Mimi, and Lestara watched the relieved units settle into places all around. A number of them nodded to sleep almost as soon as they were no longer required to stand. Lestara glanced at Caven, her face more relaxed than it had been in some time. They will need food, she said, but for now, rest is good. And rest a while they may, a voice said, making Caven and the others turn to look. Our doors are ever open to the weary. A robe-clad figure strode forward, backlit by the fire. He held his hands out in one of the Thrave's customary gestures of benevolence. Caven noted the elaborate cut of the robes. This man was not another rank-and-file clergyman. He was an abbot and the head of this church. Lestara and Caven bowed their heads. Mimi noticed what they had done and imitated them, a beat or two behind. Our thanks, Your Holiness, Lestara said. The abbot shook his head. It is nothing. When we are called to he trailed off, gaze fixed on Caven as the big man casually removed his mask. The abbot's eyes widened. Caven tensed, watching the unexpected change cross the abbot's face. His mind raced, shuffling through possible explanations as moments of silence passed, with the abbot apparently stunned beyond words. "Caven Rutger," the abbot finally said. Hearing him speak again, Caven's mind belatedly seized on the voice and placed it where it belonged in his memory. "Friar Dorian," Caven said, voice low. The robed man's mouth tightened into a pained smile. "So you remember me. Nowadays it's Abbot Dorian." Mimi shot Caven a confused look. Lestara did as well, mouth going dry as she realized she, after so many years, was on the cusp of learning something about Caven's life before the day he wandered into her warband's encampment. Back then, he was a young man covered in burn scars, with Hayden loyally following him, half a servant and half a mentor, teaching young Caven, keeping him alive. How they came to be wandering together, Lestara never knew for sure. "Rutger," Lestara echoed. "You have a surname?" Caven nodded slowly. Lestara stared. "So you hail from an elevated family." Caven tucked his chin to his chest and said nothing. "No!" a voice rang out sharply, making Caven raise his head like a startled deer, straining to hear the next sound. Was that my brother? Caven thought, eyes wide. "Stop this!" another voice screamed, this one belonging to his mother. Heart thundering, Caven broke into a run through the bushes and ferns behind his family's compound. He broke the screen of foliage, leaping onto the grounds and blinking dazedly in the orange beams of setting sun. He blinked again, struggling to clear his eyes as he stared at the rear of his longhouse. Smoke rose from it, oily tendrils wavering across the sky. Flames leaped from one side of the roof. Caven dashed forward, stumbling across shapes in the grass which could have been bodies, though he was unable to parse any longer what was happening around himself. All was consumed in the glare of an angry star. In a haze, he struggled against the door of the longhouse, but it was locked or stuck. He rushed for a window and heaved himself through it. His mind swirled. Smoke crawled across the ceiling. The hot, stifling interior grew more unbearable with each passing moment, as Caven looked frantically for his mother, father, and brother. Someone pushed forward through the smoke, face muffled in damp cloth. Caven collided with him, the impact making them both stagger. Caven fell. The muffled man snarled, kicking angrily at Caven before his bearings could return, as a man would kick a dog. A second shape bounded out of the smoke, tackling the man in the muffler, eyes stinging, coughing furiously. Caven dimly saw that the new figure was his father. The men rolled across the floor of the longhouse, struggling over control of a long knife Caven now realized had been in the first man's hand all along. The two of them moved. Something happened, and Caven's father slumped away as the other man scrambled to his feet. Blood flowed. Caven staggered forward, coughing and retching, grabbing for a hand axe he now saw someone had dropped on the stone floor. He swung it with all his strength, burying the blade in the man's thigh. He roared in agony, collapsing. He grasped Caven's lapel as he keeled over, hurling him bodily into a heap of burning debris. The smoke and pain curled in. Light failed. There was only screaming. It didn't matter who it was. In the abbot's private chambers, Caven and Mimi sat side by side, both with hot mugs of tea wrapped in their fingers. The mug almost vanished underneath Caven's slabs of hands, but still he sat stooped over the little heat source, wrapping his shoulders and chest around the rising wisps of steam. Also at the small table, Lestara sat, her elbows resting on the tabletop, her mug of tea virtually untouched as she waited in silence for the conversation to resume between Caven and the abbot. At the rear wall of the room, Hayden sat on a bench seat near a small fireplace, having been summoned from the main hall to join the group. He had been offered a seat at the table, but he demurred, taking a place befitting the servant he persistently saw himself to be. Mimi had been given clean, simple, new garments the Thrave had on hand, owing to the unfortunate hole near the collarbone which ventilated her previous heavy tunic and undermined its usefulness in cold. Across from them all, Abbot Dorian sat in a grand chair of dark walnut, pale hands holding armrests carved like harps, in a failed effort to appear utterly calm. The small room was quiet except for the crackle of the fireplace. All eyes were fixed on Caven, waiting for him to speak. A moment passed before he did. "It has been a long time," he said flatly. Abbot Dorian." Dorian shut his eyes lightly, as if thinking about how to answer. "It has," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "And yet not a day has gone by that I have not regretted what happened to your family. The end which came to the Rutgers was an atrocity." Caven shrugged, eyes not rising from his tea. "If you believed it was an atrocity," he said blithely, "you would not have voted to reward the men who committed it." "Abbot." The last word carried a sudden, searing sting like a hidden wasp. The implication that the abbot had turned a blind eye to evil for the sake of his own ambitions was more potent for being unspoken, and more potent still for being true. Dorian frowned. "I wish I had done more for you," he said. "More than nothing," a voice said. Caven and the others twisted in their seats, glancing back at Hayden. The old man was pale with anger, his rigid control of himself splintering and fraying. He bit back his next words, then cleared his throat. Nonetheless, he made no apology. In the circumstances, Dorian did not appear particularly worried about the outburst from an inferior, and brushed past it without comment. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath, his unreadable eyes moving back to Caven. "What is this about?" Mimi asked, tugging at Caven's arm. Lestara groaned. Finally, someone voiced the question. "Well, what is going on here?" Caven stared into his tea, face blank. Lestara impatiently half rose, grabbed the edges of her seat, and rotated it towards Hayden. "What is going on here?" The old man steadied himself with a breath, then glanced at Caven, looking for a cue to speak or remain silent. Almost imperceptibly, Caven nodded. Hayden scrunched his brow. "It is difficult to talk about, Commander." Lestara's gaze did not waver. "And yet I'm ordering you to speak regardless," she said. "My disarmed drowsy unit is closed in the hall beyond that door, with the town watch surrounding the building. If there is something of note in this particular abbot's history, I must know it. Dorian faced Lestara with a scowl. I resent the insinuation that Lestara returned a harder scowl than his. You may have your say after the people I trust have had theirs. Dorian closed his mouth and glowered as Lestara turned again to Hayden. Hayden heaved a sigh. You're aware, Commander, that the Thrave is intimately connected to the ruling families, the old man said. Yes, she said, motioning for Hayden to move on. I'm not, Mimi cut in. Explain this to me. Many of the individual churches, Hayden said, operate from the largesse of the elevated, eager to leverage the good works of the Thrave to spread their names, and thereby increase their influence throughout the land. Mimi furrowed her brow. What does this mean? Hayden shook his head bashfully. I'm sorry, you wouldn't have known these terms. The Thrave is the law-giving church of the Praetorians who survived the fall of the old world and re-emerged to tame the rabble which remained and smooth the way to a better existence than this life. Those Praetorians are our saints, and their example is what we strive to embody. The elevated are the living lineages of the old worlders, families which survived in bunkers in the mountains to the north and emerged to spread law and knowledge amongst the ignorant stranded, the masses whose forebears were the barbarous destroyers of civilization in this land. Mimi nodded slowly. I see. So the elevated created the Thrave as their instrument to subjugate and impose their will upon the rest of humanity. Hayden froze, staring at Mimi. Lestara nodded approvingly as Abbot Dorian continued to glower. Hayden stammered. I suppose you could put it that way. She could, and did, Lestara said, smirking. Go on, Hayden. Not all the elevated families are good and righteous, Hayden said, acid in his tone. There is backstabbing amongst them. There is vying for power. Mimi frowned. She glanced at Caven, her eyes becoming abstracted, as if seeing something the others could not. Another elevated family, Mimi said, made a move against yours. You were betrayed by someone close to you. Yes, Caven said, breaking his long silence. Lestara nearly jumped at his deep, unexpected voice. Mimi's face fell. She reached out, touching Caven's sleeve, just as she had in the clearing in the trees under the aurora. Flames, Mimi whispered. Flames. You were burned alive. She shut her eyes, grimacing as if in pain. Caven nodded, eyes never leaving his tea. How old were you? Lestara asked softly, staring at Caven. I was 11, Caven said flatly, when my cousin led another elevated family to wipe out our own. After that cousin cleared the way for himself to ascend, he gained power and prestige within the Thrave. He was advanced by the body of his peers, Caven added, while he glanced coldly at Dorian, and named a thresher when my burns had not yet healed. It is good to know his ascendancy bore fruit for those who supported him. Dorian dropped his eyes, showing enough decency to be chagrined. I cannot forget that day, Hayden stammered hollowly, eyes vacant. When I returned from the marketplace, It had already happened. The slaughtered were strewn everywhere. Hayden paused, lips tight. He shook himself. A small, half-ruined boy had dragged himself from the burning mansion, refusing to perish. I took him in my arms and ran for the trees, fearing our enemies were not really gone. I came too late to save others. I had failed to help the Rutger family, but there was a lone scion left. I could not fail him, too. That particular recollection hurt Hayden too badly to continue speaking. The old man made a gesture of supplication with his hand and turned away, eyes suffused with water. As Hayden hid his face in his palm, silence fell upon the group, each sunk in thoughts of their own. Caven cleared his throat, staring into his cooling tea and the bits of leaves scattered at the bottom of the cup, as though the ruddy liquid were the vital core of his memories. "We returned as the sun set," he said. "I recall how the dead filled hastily dug graves in what had once been gardens, the mingled smells rich enough to make weeping harder than might be expected. A few dazed servants who had escaped the carnage had returned to dig. My family was beloved. The servants would not leave with this burial undone. Afterwards, they departed the ruined compound of my dead clan for the last time." Lestara reached for Caven's hand. "And from that day, Hayden raised you," she said, her comprehension of things solidifying. Caven nodded, adding nothing aloud. Lestara rubbed her temples with her free hand, eyes downcast as she thought through all she had learned. "But," she asked after a pause, "who is Dorian to you, then?" Hayden made a soft growling sound in his throat. "He was a friar at a tiny church in those days," the old man said. "We went there seeking sanctuary after the massacre, and Dorian sent us away because he felt which way the wind was blowing. He was afraid of retribution against himself if he was found to be sheltering a survivor of the Rutger family." Mimi turned her head slowly, looking at Abbot Dorian. "This is your Thrave. These are its works." A vacantness crept into her eyes. Something electric hummed in the quiet room. Caven heard it and, at last, raised his gaze, glancing at Mimi. Her face was blank. Something rose inside of her. 1,000 armies rattling pikes would not have matched the menace radiating from her. A leviathan unwound its coils, so huge that its movement could make an ocean flood its banks. Her voice was hers, but beneath it rumbled a multitude. "All your saints and all your gods are dead. You love them for that. This is a cult of death. You despise life and the world. Wisdom to you is to sleep unperturbed by dreams." A glow arose in Mimi's eyes. Abbot Dorian paled, sitting straighter in his seat as he saw that baleful cerulean light, gripped by the sudden realization that Mimi was far more than he saw before him. Dorian sputtered, his bewildered mind catching up with the reality that he sat under the eyes of an unappeasable judge who was taking stock of everything he was and believed, and was ready to burn whole kingdoms to the ground if he could not justify their existence. "The Thrave is flawed, perhaps," he pleaded. barely restrained terror mingling with indignancy in his voice. "But until I see before me a better means of instilling civil discipline and private virtue, I will accept it and its liturgies for what they're worth." Mimi's lips compressed into a thin line as she drew a breath. "Is it virtue to crave death like your saints?" she asked. "It's no wonder the society the elevated built has no place for altruism, no place for humanity. But those they rule are forever brutalized and miserable in the world as they've made it. They must constantly seek scapegoats for the failures they endlessly perpetuate, so the oppressed will hate themselves and not hate those who oppress them." She moved to stand, her chair's legs scraping noisily on the floorboards. Caven put a hand on Mimi's arm. She hesitated, blinking. The baleful light vanished from her blue eyes. She lowered herself into her seat. The electric hum subsided, the crackle of the fireplace again becoming audible. A leviathan dropped back into the deep, sinking until the light could no longer reach it. Lestara bowed her head, throat tight. She was moved to whisper a fragment she knew of an old druidic prayer, even though she didn't know what it meant. Caven fixed the pale, chastised Dorian in a stare. "My comrades need food." Dorian nodded. "They will have it," he said, "and you shall all have a secure place to stay for as long as it is required." The clergyman retrieved a quantity of hard wheat biscuits from their stores, and after shaking most of the worms out of them, crumbled them into hot water and pork fat. Flavoring the cauldrons of slop with salt and spices, they expanded the biscuits into a meal for the hungry unit, and spread it amongst them in wooden bowls. Starving, none of the warfighters balked at the hot, greasy stuff. Conversely, they considered it the most delicious thing they had eaten in memory. After they were fed, the warfighters picked places throughout the hall and bedded down to sleep. Underneath a small table, in a tight cocoon of blankets, Mimi drifted off to sleep as well. Caven walked in the moonlight, unaided eyes peering amongst the dark trees, seeing nothing in the blackness around him. The mossy forest floor under his boots was laced with small wildflowers, their ashen petals glowing wherever dappled moonbeams pierced the leafy canopy overhead. He heard the slosh of water and soon saw a reflection of the full moons on the warbled black mirror of a lake beyond some trees, stirred by a steady breeze. He turned towards the water, moving slowly through the dense, quiet forest. As he stepped around a final tree to stop at the sloped bank, he saw a shape glide across the reflected moon and stars. A swan, silvery white feathers bright against the black water. Caven watched the silent shape, breathing slowly. A ripple moved through the inverted sky as something rose beneath the crisp surface. A disturbance moved towards the swan. Caven opened his mouth to scream a warning at the unaware creature as the ripple surged in its direction, but he had no voice. He could only watch, frozen in horror. Tendrils broke from the lake, slick, plum purple, serpentine, whipping through the dark air, grasping blindly at the swan. The waterfowl realized too late that it had been overtaken. It raised its powerful wings, beating them loudly in the night, but even as it heaved itself towards the sky, the tendrils had already snaked around its legs, wrenching it towards the depths. Caven could not watch. the quick, frantic struggle. He turned away and dashed for the trees, hearing the cries of the swan behind him, thrashing in the water as it was dragged beneath. "Caven!" He froze in an agony of confusion and terror, the clear word the dying swan had spoken reverberating in his frazzled mind. He turned and glimpsed not the silver white of the swan's feathers, but his brother being dragged beneath the roiled water, his face vanishing as Caven looked, leaving only a hand above the surface amongst the churning tendrils. Even that was quickly gone. Caven jerked awake and instinctively grasped for the spear beside him, fingers seeking the wooden shaft. The spear was not there. Briefly panicked, Caven craned his head to look, then remembered where he was, and that they had intentionally disarmed before entering deep water. While the dream lifted from his dazed brain like steam from dewy grass, he focused on slowing his breathing and his lurching heart. The nightmare has never changed before, Caven thought. Not once, in 1,000 repetitions. The swan has never spoken. I have never glimpsed my brother. I do not even remember the details of his face now that I'm awake. Why, then, did this happen? He sighed. Roused by Caven's movements, Lestara grumbled, nestled against his side. She turned over, blinking at him in the dark. "What is it?" she asked, voice gruff with sleep. Caven stared at the ceiling rafters, his head resting on the floorboards. "It is nothing. The usual nightmare." Lestara said something too quiet to be heard, then was asleep again.